The year was 1886, and the wind across the Wyoming Territory already had the bite of a serrated knife, though September had only just begun to bleed its color into the aspens. For Elara Vance, the wind was a clock, each gust a tick closer to a winter she would face for the first time as a widow. Her husband Thomas lay on the small rise behind their cabin, under a cairn of stones she had placed herself, his absence a hollow space as vast and unforgiving as the landscape. He had been a man of broad shoulders and simple solutions. Winter was coming, so you chopped more wood. The larder was low, so you hunted. But Thomas had never solved the problem of the root cellar. Theirs, dug into the slight hillock beside the house, was a place of perpetual disappointment. It was too damp in the autumn, turning potatoes to a soft, stinking mush by Christmas. By February, the frost, having pierced the packed earth of its ceiling, would creep down the walls in crystalline veins, turning the last of their carrots and turnips to icy stone. Thomas had always accepted this as fate, a tax levied by the land itself. Elara did not have the luxury of such acceptance. With only her son, 8-year-old Jacob, to feed, failure was not an option. This was why, on this particular morning, her neighbors found her not mending the faulty cellar, but clearing the debris from a different hole in the ground. The old, failed well her father had dug and abandoned 15 years prior. It was a place of local lore, a minor monument to folly. Her father, a man more interested in the language of stone and soil than in conversation with people, had spent an entire summer on that well. He had chosen the spot not by dowsing or convenience, but by some internal logic he never fully explained. He dug past the topsoil, past the dense clay, and deep into the layered shale, a good 50 feet down, only to find nothing, not a drop of water. It was a dry hole, a testament to wasted effort, and it had been a source of quiet amusement in the valley ever since. Now, to see his widowed daughter hauling out bucket after bucket of accumulated leaves, stones, and sun-bleached animal bones seemed to confirm a tragic inheritance of poor judgment. Amos Kelleher, whose land bordered hers, was the first to stop his wagon. He was a practical man, his opinions as solid and square as the timbers of his barn. He watched her strain at the rope, her face set in a mask of concentration, and shook his head with a sigh that was part pity, part exasperation. "Elara," he called out, his voice carrying easily on the thin air. "What in heaven's name are you doing with that old sorrow pit? Your time would be better spent chinking the walls on your cabin." He climbed down from his wagon, his boots crunching on the dry ground. He was not an unkind man, but he saw the world in terms of proven methods and predictable outcomes. A dry well was a failed well. That was its nature, its unshakable truth. "The ground is wrong there," he stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact recited from the community's collective memory. "Your father learned that the hard way. It won't hold the cool properly. It's all that fractured shale. It'll weep with the spring thaw and likely freeze solid halfway down come January. It's no place for keeping food." His logic was sound, built upon decades of shared experience in this unforgiving land. A cellar needed stable, dense earth around it, a blanket of clay to insulate it. This hole was a chimney, a direct conduit to the worst the weather had to offer. Elara paused, wiping a sheen of sweat from her brow with the back of a dusty forearm. She offered him a tight, polite smile, but did not stop her work. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Kelleher," she said, her voice even. "I have my reasons." Her refusal to elaborate, to defend her peculiar labor, only deepened his conviction that she was lost in grief. He saw a woman clinging to a relic of her father's own foolishness, perhaps seeking some connection to the man by repeating his mistakes. Later that day, his wife Dora made a point of visiting with a small loaf of bread and a pot of broth, gestures of charity that felt more like assessments of Alara's fitness. Dora's pity was more overt, her words weaving a narrative of tragedy for the other women at the next church social. "Poor thing," she would say, her voice hushed with performative sympathy. "Grief has addled her senses, digging at her father's old mistake as if she'll find an answer there. Her Thomas gone not 6 months, and she's already lost to the world." Among the women, only Constance Hartwell, a widow herself for 10 years, watched from a distance with a different kind of expression. It was not pity, but a cautious, silent curiosity. She understood that survival sometimes required a departure from the common road, and she withheld her judgment, content to simply observe. The community saw a woman digging a hole. Alara, however, was descending into a memory. As she worked, the scent of the disturbed earth, cool, metallic, ancient, transported her back to being a girl of 12, watching her father, Liam, at this very spot. He had not been a farmer, but a stonemason, a man who understood the world from the bedrock up. He read the land not for what grew upon it, but for what it was made of. He had taught her the names and textures of the different strata as he dug, the loamy topsoil, the dense rust-colored clay, and then the prize, the layers of gray and black shale that flaked apart in his hands like pages of a book. He had never spoken of finding water. He had talked of something else, a concept he called deep earth temperance. He believed that far below the frost line, the earth held a constant, unassailable cold, a stability that the fluctuating temperatures of the surface could not touch. "Most folks just dig a pit," he had told her one evening, his hands clean but his fingernails permanently underlined with dirt. "They bury their food in the shallows, in the same ground that freezes and thaws with the seasons. They're fighting the air." He crumbled a piece of shale in his palm. But the real cold, the lasting cold, isn't in the air. It's in the stone, deep down. The earth breathes, Alara, slow breaths, a year long. In winter, a little of the deep warmth sighs up. Not much, just enough to keep the ice away. In summer, the deep cool holds on, like a memory of winter. You just have to dig deep enough to feel it. The well had been an experiment. He had been searching not for the water table, but for a specific confluence of stone and depth. He had found the geology he wanted, but the community, seeking only water, had declared it a failure. He had simply capped it with old timbers and walked away, his quiet knowledge intact. "Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle," he'd once said. They saw a dry hole. He saw a perfectly calibrated thermal reservoir. Alara had tried to explain a fraction of this to Amos Kelleher, hoping to quell the tide of pity and concern. "It's not about the damp, Mr. Kelleher," she had said, leaning on her shovel. "It's about the depth. My father said this shaft goes through the clay and taps into the deep shale. It holds a different kind of cold, a stable cold that doesn't freeze." Amos had merely blinked at her, his expression unchanging. The words were meaningless to him. Cold was cold. A hole was a hole. "Alara," he had said, his tone gentle, as if speaking to a child. "Shale is just rock. It gets as cold as any other rock. You're putting your boys' winter meals at risk on a dead man's fancy." He could not grasp the distinction she was trying to make, the difference between the violent, invasive frost of the surface and the passive, consistent chill of the deep earth. His world was governed by what he could see and touch, by the proven wisdom of generations. The idea of a hole that could regulate its own temperature was a story, a folk tale, and he saw it as his duty to steer her back toward the hard shores of reality. His dismissal was not malicious, but it solidified her isolation. She knew then that she could not explain. She could only do. The work was brutal, a solitary battle against gravity and geology. First came the clearing. For days, she hauled bucket after bucket of debris, her muscles screaming in protest. Then came the descent. She fashioned a crude bosun's chair from a plank of wood and thick rope slung over a sturdy tripod of timbers. Lowering herself into the darkness was an act of faith. The air changed as she went down. The first 10 feet smelled of sun-baked earth and dry leaves. Below that, the dense clay walls held a damp, cool smell. Then, as the lantern light began to glint off the dark, flat surfaces of the shale, the air became different yet again. It was cold, but not sharp. It was a still, ancient cold, the scent of stone and time itself. It was the air her father had described, the breath of the deep earth. She felt a surge of conviction, a quiet certainty that she was in the right place. At the bottom, a full 50 feet down, the shaft was just wide enough for her to stand. This was where the real labor began. Her father had only sunk the shaft. He had not hollowed out the larder. Using a small handpick and a shovel, she began to carve out a chamber, a small room within the stratum of dark gray shale. It was painstaking, exhausting work. Each swing of the pick sent jarring vibrations up her arms. She filled a bucket with the fractured rock, signaled to Jacob above, and waited as he slowly, carefully, hauled it to the surface, his small face a mask of serious concentration. They worked this way for 2 weeks, their days governed by the rhythm of pick, shovel, and rope. The air in the chamber was thin, and the lantern cast dancing shadows on the walls. But with every inch she gained, her resolve hardened. She was not just digging a cave. She was shaping a principle into a physical space. Once the chamber was large enough, about 6 feet wide and 5 feet high, she began the finishing work. She had spent the evenings gathering smooth, flat stones from the creek bed that ran through the edge of her property. Now she carried them down in buckets and began to line the floor and the rough-hewn walls of her chamber. It was slow, meticulous work, fitting the stones together like a puzzle, creating clean, dry surfaces that would not shed dust or grit onto her provisions. She was her father's daughter, and she knew the satisfaction of a well-set stone. Next came the shelving. She used timber salvaged from an old shed that had collapsed the previous winter, sawing the weathered planks to size by lantern light at the bottom of the well. She installed 3 sturdy shelves along the back wall, anchoring them deep into the shale. They were simple, but they were strong, ready to bear the weight of her harvest and her hopes for the coming winter. The final and most critical piece of the construction was the cap. A simple lid would not do. It had to be an impenetrable barrier against the surface world. She built a heavy, square frame of thick timbers to sit over the well's opening. Into this, she fitted a solid floor of thick planks. She then built a second frame a foot above the first, creating a space between them. This cavity she packed meticulously with everything she could find that held air and resisted cold. Sawdust from her woodpile, dried moss she had gathered from the north side of trees, and clumps of raw wool from a sheep that had perished in the spring. Finally, she nailed a second layer of heavy planks over the top, creating a thick, insulated sandwich of wood and natural batting. It was immensely heavy, requiring a long lever to move, but it was precisely what was needed. It was not a door to be opened casually, but a seal to be broken only when necessary. When it was finished, she stood back, her body aching, her hands raw, and looked at the squat, formidable structure. It was ugly and crude, but it was a perfect expression of her father's idea. A sealed capsule of deep earth temperance, entirely disconnected from the volatile world of wind and snow above. October came, and with it the first hard frost. The ground, which had been soft and yielding, became as hard as iron overnight. A delicate filigree of ice coated every surface in the mornings, a beautiful and menacing warning. Across the valley, her neighbors hurried with the last of their harvest, their voices sharp with urgency as they filled their own cellars. Ilara worked with a deliberate, unhurried calm. She and Jacob harvested their potatoes, brushing the dry soil from their skins but not washing them. They pulled their carrots and turnips, trimming the tops, and carefully gathered the last of the apples from their 2 small trees. Instead of carrying them to the flawed cellar by the house, they carried them to the new, strange larder. One by one, she lowered the baskets down into the cool darkness, arranging them carefully on the stone floor and the wooden shelves. The potatoes in burlap sacks, the root vegetables in crates of sand, the apples wrapped individually in newspaper. When the last basket was in place, she paused, breathing in the scent of the chamber one last time, that unique mixture of cold stone, fresh earth, and harvest. Then, with Jacob's help, she slid the heavy, insulated cap into place, driving wooden pegs into the frame to secure it. The seal was complete. The work was done. Now, there was only waiting. Winter arrived not as a gentle transition, but as an invasion. A blizzard in early November buried the landscape under 2 feet of snow, and the cold that followed was relentless. The wind howled for days on end, piling drifts against the north wall of her cabin until the window was entirely obscured. The world shrank to the confines of their small home, the shriek of the wind and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. For her neighbors, this was the beginning of the cellar season, a time of constant vigilance. They worried about ventilation, about dampness, about the encroaching frost. They would open their cellar doors on warmer days to let out the moisture, and pack snow against the entrances during cold snaps to add insulation. It was a constant, anxious negotiation with the weather. Ilara did none of this. Her only task was to keep the heavy snow cleared from the well cap, preventing the sun from melting it and allowing water to seep into the frame. Her mastery of the system was expressed through inaction. She had built a fortress of stability, and its greatest strength was that it required no interference. But this faith in process was its own kind of trial. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. Christmas came and went. Through the deep cold of January, as the temperature outside stayed below 0 for a fortnight, a seed of doubt began to sprout in her mind. The voices of her neighbors echoed in her thoughts. Amos Kelleher's confident assertion that the shale would freeze. Dora's pitying glances. What if they were right? What if her father's theory had been just a fancy and her interpretation of it flawed? She could not check. To open the cap would be to break the seal, to flood the stable chamber with the vicious, freezing air of the surface. It would ruin the experiment and, quite possibly, all of her food at once. She had to trust the principle. She had to trust her memory of her father's quiet confidence. She had to trust the feeling of the air she had felt on her own skin deep in that shaft. Every day she looked at the silent, snow-covered cap, and she chose to believe. Jacob, sensing her quiet tension, would ask, "Are the apples okay, Mama?" And she would force a confident smile and say, "They're sleeping, Jacob. In the cold, quiet dark. They're just fine." By mid-February, the valley was deep in the hungry months, the time when the novelty of winter had long worn off, replaced by a monotonous diet of salted meat and whatever remained in the cellars. The talk at the general store was of rot and frost. The Hartwell family had lost half their potatoes to a black rot. The Kelleher's cellar, despite Amos's diligent care, had suffered a deep freeze during the January cold snap. Their apples were mush, their carrots translucent with ice. Scarcity was a palpable presence, a guest at every dinner table. Ilara's own supplies in the cabin were running low. The time had come. She could wait no longer. One afternoon, when the sun was bright but the air was still bitterly cold, she took a deep breath and told Jacob, "We're going to open it." The snow around the well cap was packed hard, and it took her the better part of an hour to shovel it clear. She then had to chip away the ice that had fused the heavy lid to its frame. Finally, she fitted the long timber she used as a lever into its notch and put her full weight against it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan of complaining wood, the cap shifted. A faint wisp of vapor, like a ghost of breath, puffed from the crack. She pushed harder, sliding the heavy lid aside just enough to create an opening. She peered into the black square. The air that rose to meet her was not the foul, stagnant air of decay she had been secretly dreading. It was shockingly clean. It was cold, yes, but it was a living cold, carrying the clean scent of damp stone, the faintest sweetness of apples, and the earthy perfume of potatoes. It smelled of life, preserved. With her heart pounding, she lit a lantern and, tying it to a rope, lowered it into the shaft. Jacob stood beside her, his eyes wide, peering into the darkness. The light descended, illuminating the rough-hewn walls, and then the chamber. She saw the burlap sacks, looking exactly as they had when she placed them there. She saw the crates of sand, undisturbed. She saw the faint, pale shapes of the apples on the shelves. Holding her breath, she secured the rope and climbed down the ladder she had left in the shaft. Stepping onto the stone floor of the chamber was like stepping into another season. The air was perfectly still, the silence absolute. She reached into a burlap sack and pulled out a potato. It was hard as a rock, cool to the touch, with no soft spots, no shriveling skin, no acrid smell of rot. She walked to the crates and dug her hand into the sand. The carrot she pulled out was firm and bright orange, snapping with a sharp crack when she broke it in two. Finally, she went to the shelves. She picked up an apple, one she had wrapped herself months ago. It was heavy in her palm, its skin smooth and taut. There was no frost, no mold, no decay. There was only perfect, suspended preservation. Standing there in the lantern light, 50 feet below the frozen world, Ilara felt a profound sense of connection, a completion of a circle that had begun 15 years earlier. She touched the cool shale wall and understood her father in a way she never had when he was alive. He had not been a fool. He had been a listener. He had listened to the slow, deep truths of the earth, and it had told him its secrets. This chamber was not just a storage space, it was a conversation. She had asked the earth, properly, as he would have said, to keep her harvest safe, and it had answered. The principle was real. The deep earth temperance was not a fancy, but a quiet, powerful force. In that moment, her creation was no longer just a well or a larder. It was a vindication, a silent monument to a father's unconventional wisdom and a daughter's unshakable faith in his teachings. A week later, the worst blizzard of the winter descended upon the valley. It came without warning, a wall of white that erased the world and raged for 3 straight days. The wind was a physical force, shaking the cabins and driving snow through the smallest cracks. When the storm finally broke, the landscape was transformed, buried under immense sculpted drifts. The toll on the community was severe. Livestock had been lost, and the prolonged, vicious cold had delivered the final blow to many of the conventional root sellers. Amos Kelleher's was among the worst hit. The frost had penetrated deeper than ever before. and what little had survived the January freeze was now ruined completely. He was facing the stark reality of having almost nothing to feed his family until the spring thaw. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. That evening, a tall, stooped figure appeared at Ilara's door, knocking softly. It was Amos, his hat in his hands, his face etched with worry and defeat. He did not ask for a handout. He was a man for whom charity was a last resort, a mark of failure. He cleared his throat, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Mrs. Vance," he began, his voice rough. "My Dora, she was talking to Constance Hartwell, and Constance, she said you were eating fresh apples." He said the words, fresh apples, as if they were a mythical treasure, something that could not possibly exist in this frozen world. He wasn't accusing her of lying, but of possessing some impossible magic. Ilara felt no triumph, no desire to gloat. She saw only a neighbor in need, a proud man humbled by circumstance. She simply nodded, pulled on her heavy coat, and lit a lantern. "Come with me," she said. She led him through the deep snow to the well cap. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots. She handed him the lever. "You'll need to help me. It's heavy." Together, they strained and slid the heavy lid aside. The same puff of clean, cold air rose to meet them. Amos flinched back, expecting a wave of rot. Instead, his face registered confusion. He peered into the darkness as she lowered the lantern. He saw what she had seen, a scene of impossible preservation. She climbed down and returned with a handful of carrots and 2 perfect red apples. She offered one to him. He took it, his gaze shifting from the apple in his hand to the dark hole in the ground, and then finally to her face. He took a bite. The sharp, loud crunch echoed in the still, winter air. It was the sound of crispness, of life, of a harvest just pulled from the tree. He chewed slowly, thoughtfully. He looked at the half-eaten apple, then back at the well. "I'll be," he whispered, the words thick with awe and disbelief. It was a complete surrender of his entire worldview. He looked at her, his eyes full of a question he couldn't quite form. How? This time, when she explained, he listened. She spoke of her father, of the deep earth, of the shale, and the importance of the seal. She explained the difference between the shallow cold that freezes and the deep cold that preserves. He absorbed every word, his practical mind finally grasping a principle that was more profound than simple tradition. He was not just hearing her words, he was tasting the proof. The next spring, after the thaw, Amos Kelleher did not come to her for another handout. He came with 2 other men from the valley, Hiram Poole and Josiah Hartwell. They came with shovels in their hands and respect in their eyes. They did not offer pity or advice. They asked her if she would teach them. They asked her to walk their land with them, to read the soil, and to help them find the right places to build their own deep earth larders. And so she did. She shared her father's knowledge freely, translating his quiet wisdom into practical instruction that these men could understand and execute. The Vance well, as it came to be known, was not a singular curiosity for long. Within a few years, several more shafts, dug according to the same principles, dotted the valley. They became a mark of a forward-thinking homestead, a symbol of true winter preparedness. The community's collective wisdom had been amended, its understanding of the land deepened. Ilara's father was no longer remembered as a fool who dug a dry well, but as a visionary whose ideas were simply ahead of their time. Ilara herself became a respected figure, a woman whose quiet determination had turned a legacy of perceived failure into a cornerstone of the community's survival. Her son Jacob grew up with a unique inheritance. Not just a cabin and a plot of land, but a profound understanding of the world beneath his feet. The original well, eventually lined with expert stonework by Amos Kelleher himself as a gift of gratitude, served the Vance family for over 50 years. It remained a quiet, unassuming structure on the land, a deep and lasting monument to the woman who, when faced with the world's skepticism, chose instead to listen to the wisdom of the earth.